My name's Atwal and I'm currently head teacher at Highlands Primary School. And my professional focus for a number of years has been on teacher professional learning. And that curiosity about how teachers learn in schools and what makes effective teaching began when I first started teaching in my first school in Stratford in East London. And I noticed very quickly that there were some teachers who were optimistic, positive, motivated, reflective. They spoke about teaching and learning during their spare time, and they had this fascination about being the best teacher they could possibly be. And at the same time, I was surrounded by teachers who were the opposite, demotivated, negative about children, negative about education, and that left me feeling really frustrated because it made me realise that it was inherently unfair that your life chances, your education chances for that year was dependent on which teacher you got. And I really thought at that time, looking back, how do I create an environment, or how can I support an environment in which every teacher is that motivated and enthusiastic? I also at the same time realised that I'd had a fantastic experience during my training year. And one of the reasons was I had engaged in research. And suddenly I was starting my first year and I realised, well, how am I going to continually improve? How am I going to develop if I don't get the opportunity to reflect on my practice, engage in research, trial changes? So I made the decision to do a master's at University of East London, where I'd done my PTE. And I took advice from senior leaders, and I was advised not to do it because they said your NQT year is so difficult. How could you possibly do a master's? So I decided, not for the first time, to ignore that advice, and I started it anyway, and I did it in secret. And I at that time I was really focused on my own practice, being the best teacher that I could be, and I don't think I would have progressed without that engagement at master's level. By the time I was in my third year, I was made responsible for teacher learning across the school, which was fantastic because it gave me more opportunities to try and experiment with the kind of practice that I was reading about from industry, where you quite commonly talk about the learning organisation. And I was really realising that schools weren't really learning organisations, or not authentic learning organisations. And that for me is a big irony, because how comes in the very institutions where the core business is learning, children's learning, that adults' learning was so poor? And so as I progressed in those first few years, masters, I did a certification for the teaching of PSHTE because I was particularly interested in children's emotional development, personal development, social development. Then I did my MPQH to qualify as head teacher, and I thought, what can I do next? And I realised that the only real next step was to do a doctorate. And a doctorate is the most amazing learning experience I've ever been involved in. Most challenging, but most rewarding as well. My focus was on what are the factors that affect teacher engagement in professional learning activities in schools, with a particular focus on action research. And it was fantastic because I was looking at research from across the world. And at the end of my second year, near my third year, I had a new tutor who came over from Australia, and she said that I should look at workplace learning theories. And at that time I'd been focused really on what continuing professional development looks like, or what teachers engage in schools. And my eyes were open to this whole new world of how workers learn in other workplaces. And I have to admit, it really, I was fascinated. And I looked at how steel workers learn. And I looked particularly at Latham Wenger's work from 1991 on situated learning and legitimate peripheral participation, which is arguing that you judge the quality of the learning environment from the newest entrant, and how do they engage in social learning in the workplace. If I compare that to schools, there is lots of learning in terms of adults, but it's tacit learning, intuitive learning and non-contextual learning. because most of the time teachers are working in isolation in their classrooms, bungling along, trying things out, thinking what they're doing is working, but how do they know what they're doing is having an impact? So through the course of my doctorate, I developed a conceptual framework which firstly looked at the different factors at wider society level, governmental level, how they influence what happens in schools, including Ofsted. Then I looked at the expansiveness of the learning environment, in which schools in which there was high trust or there was empowerment of staff, there was greater opportunities for learning. But I also looked at individual dispositions to learning. So the argument that even if two teachers in the same school are subject to the same learning environment, the same learning experiences, they may interpret those learning experiences in different ways. So individual dispositions. The result of my research was a framework called the Dynamic Learning Community, in which I argue that the implementation of certain formal professional learning opportunities will have an impact on informal learning in the workplace, with the argument that if I can create an environment which supports informal learning, that there will be far more engagement in learning across the week. In terms of the reason I call it dynamic is for two ways, that there's a dynamism for the individual in that they have an energy to want to learn and want to develop, but also a dynamism in terms of the environment, that by a teacher coming into that environment, the energy in terms of engaging with others who have those same positive attitudes and dispositions will just add to the learning environment. So in terms of where I've got to with my book, I was asked at my Viva, now that you finished your doctorate, your thesis is sitting there, what do you want to do? And I'd got to the point where I didn't want to see that thesis again, because I'd got to the point where you're sort of writing for an external audience and some of the enjoyment has gone out of it. But I didn't want the learning to be lost. I feel that I think to a large extent what I've done in terms of schools is unique, and I wanted to share that. So I thought the best way to do that was through like a practical practitioner's guide for school leaders. And I was asked at the time, what do you want to call the book? And straight away the first thing that came into my head was The Thinking School. Because when I go into a classroom, I don't necessarily want to look at the outcomes in terms of what's in the books. I want to look at the level of critical thinking that the children are engaging in, that the adults are engaging in. And the impact on our school in terms of our journey is a very interesting one, but also a very powerful one, because I think the environment in which we work in schools in terms of marketisation of education actually does not encourage schools to take risks and be creative. Now, when I first started at Highlands Primary School in 2012, literally 6 weeks before I started, the school was put into a category by Ofsted, was told it was deemed to require an improvement. The teachers were very willing, but were on their knees in terms of their morale. Very hierarchical leadership structure, which isn't uncommon in schools. And at the time I was told, because we were requiring improvement, that you're entitled to more days from your school improvement partner. And she came to see me and she said, what are your plans? And I said, well, I've got these plans from my research. I'm going to enable all the teachers to have time and space to learn their craft over time. Over a term, we're going to investigate our practice. We're going to look at assessment for learning. We're going to engage in research. And every year group is going to participate in a collaborative action research project where they investigate a particular question that impacts upon their children's engagement in learning and their progress. And I'm going to support them to engage in peer learning, lesson study, to develop their knowledge and understanding. I think she thought I was completely mad. She told me that I shouldn't do any of that the teachers weren't ready for that what I did need to do was to go into each classroom and see each teacher and give them a judgment according to a scale of outstanding, good, requiring improvement, unsatisfactory, and then set them targets for improvement because I needed to demonstrate that, because if Ofsted returned, which they would do within 16 months, if I was still requiring improvement, I would lose my job. So I did the only decent thing I could do, which was tell her I would do exactly what she'd asked me to do, asked if she wanted another coffee, saw her politely out, and then did exactly what I was going to plan to do in the first place. And the impact has been fantastic. So many different ways. 7 years later, we're sitting here. Many of those teachers that were told not only they were requiring improvement but were unsatisfactory are being told they're outstanding. The school is outstanding in every aspect. Even though what we don't do for Ofsted. The outcomes for the children put us regularly in the top 3% of schools nationally for pupil progress. We've been awarded the Mayor of London Schools for Success Award for 3 consecutive years, one of only 34 primary or secondary schools in London. But most importantly, we are bucking the trend in terms of retention and recruitment of staff. Over those 7 and a bit years, even from when we were requiring improvement, we've spent a grand total of £28 on recruitment, retention, advertising for staff. Each year we do not have enough spaces for all the teachers that would like to work here. We have had 13 teachers complete their masters, of which we pay 60%. Another 15 are on the journey. So it is not difficult as a leader to lead a group of empowered, reflective practitioners who understand their craft. And I'm not afraid to say that in other workplaces, and I've looked at hairdressers, for example, or those on a building site, there are far more opportunities for informal and formal learning. The other thing we did is we operate a completely distributed leadership model in which every member of staff has a voice, is able to make decisions, is research informed. My title is Head Learning Leader because I want to emphasise learning. I'm not a big fan of even the word teacher because it implies that the teacher is the person with the knowledge and the children are there as empty vessels to be filled with knowledge. So what we're looking at is creating a completely different conceptualisation of the role of the teacher. Someone who's expected to be creative, take risks, to engage in research, to continually learn and grow. Our philosophy here is we're constantly improving. It's not about change for change's sake, but constantly developing. In every other industry, if you bought a new car, you expect it to be improvement on the model that you had from 3 years ago. There's research coming out of Chicago which suggests that the average teacher stops improving in their 3rd year of teaching. Now, I would be bored if I stopped improving, and I'm sure everybody else here would be bored. So our focus is on spreading our practice so that the same sense of well-being and engagement and empowerment that our staff have is reflected beyond our school and in other schools. So the last sentence in the book is how do we move from a thinking school to a thinking school system? Because if we want our children to be empowered, creative, critical thinkers, then they need to be led by a team of empowered, creative, critical thinkers. And me as the lead learner, and I still teach every day, is my responsibility is to create an environment in which everybody is learning and everybody is growing and developing, and that really is the concept behind the thinking school.